The rain hammered against the windows of the roadside diner that night, isolating the small establishment from the rest of the world like a glass bubble in a storm. Ethan Voss was hunched over the counter, clutching his smartphone as though it were the last thread connecting him to everything he loved. His fingers were white-knuckled around the cheap plastic case, and his breathing came in short, shallow gasps that did nothing to calm the panic clawing up his throat. On the other end of the line, the voice of the social services investigator, a woman named Miss Hartley, sounded cold and procedural, driving every word like a nail into the coffin of his hope. "Mr. Voss, this isn't a negotiation. It's a legal assessment. Due to your documented history with domestic violence, your current unstable housing situation, and the lack of a recognized family structure, Judge Morrison was very clear in this afternoon's emergency hearing. If you cannot present lawful marriage documentation and proof of permanent residence by noon tomorrow, your son will be transferred into protective custody. You have exactly 14 hours. No house, no legal spouse, no child. Those are the court's terms." The call ended with a dry click. Ethan slowly pulled the phone away from his ear, feeling the blood freeze in his veins. He stared at the rain-streaked windows, his reflection ghostly and fragmented in the glass. His waiter's uniform, tan with short sleeves and a collar that had seen better days, hung loose on his thin frame. His brown hair, pulled back in a messy ponytail, clung to his damp forehead. He looked exhausted, hollowed out, like someone who'd been running so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stop. He looked out at the dark parking lot where his 10-year-old sedan sat under the pouring rain, its back seat still stuffed with the blankets and bags they'd been living out of for the past 3 weeks. That was his home. That was the stability he had to offer his 6-year-old son. That was the future a judge was about to take away. The pain was so sharp Ethan couldn't contain it. He didn't scream in anger, he crumbled. He leaned his forehead against the cold laminate counter and began to cry, a convulsive, painful sob that shook his shoulders. The diner was nearly empty, the storm keeping most people away. In that isolation, his desperation poured out uncensored. Between sobs, he let out the sentence that had been trapped in his throat, speaking just loud enough for the universe to hear his plea. "God, I need a miracle. I need a husband and a house by tomorrow morning, or I'm going to lose my baby." Ethan's miracle was standing right behind him. But he didn't know it yet. The diner was quiet except for the rain, but at the booth directly behind Ethan, those words hit Damien Blackwood like a physical blow to the chest. He hadn't planned to be there at all. He'd only stopped at this forgotten roadside diner to avoid a police checkpoint 2 miles up the highway, a routine maneuver for a man whose face appeared in Interpol briefings more often than family photographs. Damien sat with his back to the wall, as he always did, dressed in his signature black suit with no tie. The collar hung open, revealing the edge of intricate tattoos that climbed from his chest up his neck. Dark ink that spoke of allegiances, debts paid, and wars won. More tattoos wrapped around his hands like warnings written in a language most people were too afraid to read. His dark hair was slicked back, his jawline sharp and unforgiving. He had the kind of face that made people look away, not because it was cruel, but because it was too controlled, too calm. The face of an alpha who had seen violence and chosen precision over chaos. His reputation in the underworld was surgical. He was called the Black Ledger because he settled debts others couldn't, ended wars without firing a shot, and controlled entire cities from the shadows without ever needing to raise his voice. But it wasn't just his reputation that made people wary, it was the sheer, overwhelming presence of his alpha pheromones. Even now, when he was trying to be unobtrusive, the air around him seemed to thicken with the scent of rain-soaked cedar and something darker, something that spoke of power and danger in equal measure. Most Omegas in his vicinity would feel their instincts scream at them to submit, to flee, or, in rare, reckless cases, to press closer despite every survival instinct they possessed. He was a man who had built an empire on one rule: never get involved in innocent lives. But when he heard Ethan's broken plea, I need a husband by tomorrow or I'm going to lose my baby. Something inside him fractured. It was his voice. The raw desperation. The way he said baby like it was the only word left in his vocabulary that still meant anything. It reminded Damien of his mother. Damien stared down at the cold coffee in front of him, his jaw tight, his hands perfectly still on the table. He remembered the night his mother had begged a room full of men in expensive suits for help. Men who had looked at her the way society looked at people like Ethan, disposable, inconvenient, not worth the risk. No one had helped her. Damien had been 7 years old, hiding behind her legs, watching her beg. He never forgot the look in her eyes when she realized no one was coming. That same look he'd just heard in Ethan's voice. He looked at the young Omega slumped over the counter, trembling as he tried to pull himself together. Ethan's shoulders shook with each breath, and Damien could smell the bitter tang of distress pheromones cutting through the diner's grease and coffee, a scent that should have repelled him, should have made him want to distance himself from the source of such desperate and bonded Omega misery. Instead, it made something twist in his chest. He had no idea who was sitting behind him. No idea that the alpha watching him was someone most people crossed the street to avoid. But Damien knew exactly what was at stake. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and calm, and walked toward the counter. His footsteps were silent despite his size. Ethan didn't notice him at first, he was too busy wiping his face with a paper napkin, trying to breathe through the panic. Then he heard Damien's voice. Low, controlled, certain. I can be your husband. Ethan froze. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it, that his mind had broken under the weight of everything and conjured some kind of auditory hallucination. But when he slowly turned his head, he saw him. A man in a black suit. Tattoos crawling up his neck. Dark eyes that watched him with an intensity that made Ethan's breath catch. Not cruel, but unflinching. Serious. He stood there, 3 feet away, hands relaxed at his sides, waiting. And the scent that rolled off him hit Ethan like a wave, cedar and rain and something darker, something that made his hindbrain sit up and pay attention in a way it hadn't in years. This was an alpha. A powerful one. The kind whose pheromones could make lesser omegas drop to their knees without a word spoken. Ethan's first instinct was fear. Everything about him screamed danger. The tattoos, the suit, the way he stood like he owned the space around him. But his eyes, they weren't mocking him. They weren't pitying him. They were steady. What? Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. Damien didn't repeat himself. He simply held Ethan's gaze and waited for him to catch up. Ethan's mind raced. This had to be a joke. A cruel, sick joke from a stranger who'd overheard his breakdown and decided to. I'm serious, Damien said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. You need a husband by tomorrow. I can be that. Ethan stared at him, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. And in that moment, he didn't know if he was looking at salvation or something far more dangerous. Ethan couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't process what he'd just heard. The alpha stood there in his black suit, tattoos visible against his skin like battle scars turned into art, waiting with a patience that felt almost unnatural. He wasn't smiling, wasn't trying to reassure him, he'd made his offer, and now he was giving Ethan space to decide, as if proposing marriage to a complete stranger in a roadside diner was the most reasonable thing in the world. You're joking, Ethan finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. He wiped at his face again, suddenly aware of how he must look, red eyes, streaked with exhaustion, his uniform stained with ketchup from the dinner rush hours ago. I don't joke, Damien said simply. There was something in his tone that made Ethan believe him. No amusement, no mockery. Just flat, undeniable truth. Ethan's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the counter. I don't even know you. You don't know me. Why would you? He stopped, shaking his head. This is insane. It is, Damien agreed. He pulled out the stool next to Ethan and sat down, moving with the kind of controlled grace that suggested every action was calculated. Up close, Ethan could see more details, the way the tattoos disappeared beneath his collar, the faint scar along his jawline, the darkness in his eyes that spoke of things Ethan probably didn't want to understand. But insane doesn't mean impossible. Ethan laughed, a sharp, broken sound. You're a complete stranger who just, overheard me having a breakdown and decided to rescue me. That doesn't happen. People don't do that. Most people don't, Damien said quietly. I'm not most people. There was no arrogance in the statement. Just fact. Ethan stared at him, trying to read him, trying to understand what kind of alpha made an offer like this. Nothing about him made sense. The expensive suit that probably cost more than Ethan made in 3 months, the tattoos that suggested a life Ethan wanted nothing to do with, the way he sat perfectly still like a predator that had learned patience was more effective than violence. Ethan's omega instincts, dormant for so long, began to stir. He caught the scent of Damien's pheromones again, controlled, powerful, but not aggressive. It was the scent of an alpha who was in complete command of himself, who didn't need to posture or threaten because he knew exactly who and what he was. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it was grounding. Who are you? Ethan asked. Someone who can help you, Damien said. That's all you need to know right now. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters tonight. Ethan wanted to stand up, walk away, get in his car, and drive until this entire nightmare felt like a fever dream. But where would he go? Back to the motel room he could no longer afford. Back to sleeping in his car with his son curled up in blankets in the back seat, asking when they could go home. He had 14 hours. Less now. 13 maybe. Why? The word came out raw. Why would you do this for someone you don't even know? Damien was silent for a long moment. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for the first time, Ethan saw something flicker behind those controlled eyes. Something that looked like pain. Old and buried deep. Because I know what happens when no one helps, he said finally. The answer hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning Ethan didn't fully understand but felt in his bones. This alpha had lived through something. Had watched someone suffer because people looked away. I can't pay you, Ethan said desperately. I don't have money. I don't have anything. I'm not asking for payment. Then what do you want? Damien looked at him directly, and Ethan felt the full weight of his attention. It wasn't predatory, it was assessing, like he was measuring whether Ethan was strong enough for what came next. Nothing, he said. You walk into that courtroom tomorrow with a marriage certificate, a permanent address, and a husband who can stand next to you when the judge asks questions. After that, you're free to leave. No strings. No obligations. It sounded too good to be true. It sounded like a trap. People don't just give things away, especially not something this big. What's the catch? No catch, Damien said. Just rules. What rules? 1. You don't ask about my work. You don't involve yourself in my business. You stay in the house I provide until the custody situation is resolved. After the court grants you custody, you decide whether you want to stay or leave. Stay? Ethan's mind spun. Why would I stay? You might feel safer there than out here, Damien said simply. But that's your choice to make, not mine. Ethan studied his face, looking for deception, for the hidden angle that would explain why an alpha like this would offer salvation without demanding something in return. But all he saw was that same steady, unreadable calm. "This is crazy," he whispered. "Yes. I should say no." "You should," Damien agreed. "But you won't." Ethan's breath caught. "How do you know?" "Because you're not afraid of me," Damien said quietly. "You're afraid of losing your son. And fear is a powerful motivator when it's aimed at the right target." He was right. God help him, he was right. Ethan thought of his son, 6 years old, curly brown hair, gap-toothed smile, the way he held his father's hand too tight whenever they had to sleep in the car. He thought of him being taken away, placed in a system that would process him like paperwork, assigned to strangers who wouldn't know that he was afraid of thunderstorms or that he needed his stuffed rabbit to fall asleep. He thought of never seeing him again. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "If I say yes," Ethan said slowly, "and this is some kind of trap or trick or—" "It's not." "How do I know that?" Damien reached into his jacket slowly, so Ethan could see his hands, and pulled out a business card. He set it on the counter between them. It was simple, elegant, just a name and a phone number. Damien Blackwood. Ethan stared at the name. It sounded European. Formal. Expensive. "You can look me up," Damien said. "You can research. You can ask questions. But we don't have time for that tonight. You have 13 hours. I'm offering you 12 of them to make this work." Ethan picked up the card with shaking hands. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked one more time. Damien stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. "Because someone should have helped my mother," he said quietly. "And no one did." He turned toward the door, then paused. "I'll be outside. Take 5 minutes. Decide." And then he walked out into the rain, leaving Ethan alone with the most impossible decision of his life. Ethan sat frozen at the counter, staring at the business card in his trembling hands. The name Damien Blackwood seemed to pulse under the fluorescent lights. He could see the Alpha through the rain-streaked window, standing beside a black Mercedes Ethan hadn't noticed before, perfectly still despite the downpour soaking his shoulders. He wasn't looking at Ethan, wasn't pressuring him, he'd given him space to choose. And somehow that made it worse, because Ethan had already made his choice the moment the Alpha had walked away. Ethan's phone buzzed on the counter, a reminder alarm he'd set earlier. 12 hours until court. His chest tightened. In 12 hours, a judge would ask him questions he couldn't answer, would look at him with that same clinical detachment Miss Hartley had used on the phone, would sign papers that would take his son away. Unless he walked out that door. His hands were still shaking as he grabbed his coat, threadbare, 2 winters old, and pushed through the diner's entrance into the storm. Rain immediately plastered his hair to his face, cold and punishing. Damien turned as he approached, his dark eyes finding Ethan's through the downpour. "I have conditions," Ethan said, his voice stronger than he felt. Something flickered across Damien's face, approval, maybe, or respect. "Go ahead. I want everything in writing. The marriage, the terms, the timeline. I want to know exactly what I'm agreeing to." "Done. I want my own room. My son stays with me. You don't come near him without my permission." "Agreed. And when this is over, when the court gives me custody, I leave. No questions asked. No guilt. No strings." Damien held his gaze for a long moment, rain running down his face, darkening his suit. "No strings," he confirmed quietly. Ethan felt something inside him shift, not relief, but the terrible weight of a choice he couldn't take back. "Why does this feel like I'm making a deal with the devil?" "Because you probably are," Damien said, and for the first time, there was something almost like dark humor in his voice. But the devil keeps his promises, Ethan. Can you say the same about the system that's trying to take your son? He couldn't. He'd seen what the system did to children like his, shuttled between homes, lost in paperwork, their trauma documented but never healed. How do we even do this? Ethan asked, exhaustion and desperation bleeding into his voice. We can't get married in 12 hours. There are licenses, waiting periods, legal. I know people, Damien interrupted calmly. He opened the passenger door of the Mercedes. Get in. We'll handle it. Ethan stared at the open door. Expensive leather seats. Interior that probably cost more than every car he'd ever owned combined. This was the moment. Once he got in, there was no going back. He thought of his son's face. His small hand in his. The way he said daddy like it was the safest word in the world. Ethan got in the car. The Mercedes moved through the rain-soaked streets with predatory silence. Damien drove with the same controlled precision he seemed to apply to everything, economical movements, perfect awareness of his surroundings. Ethan sat rigid in the passenger seat, hyper-aware of the alpha beside him, of the decision he'd just made, of how quickly his life had spiraled into something he no longer recognized. Where are we going? He asked. To handle the paperwork. At midnight? In the middle of a storm? I told you. I know people. Ethan wanted to ask what kind of people took care of marriage licenses at midnight, but he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Instead, he focused on the city passing by outside, familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign, like he'd crossed into some parallel world where normal rules didn't apply. Why did you really stop at that diner? He asked quietly. Damien's jaw tightened slightly. Police checkpoint on Highway 7. I needed to wait it out. Were you running from something? I'm always running from something, Damien said. The trick is making sure it never catches you. It wasn't reassuring, but it was honest. They pulled up to an elegant townhouse in a neighborhood Ethan recognized as expensive, the kind where lawyers and doctors lived, where every house had security systems and property values that made his monthly salary look like pocket change. Damien parked and came around to open his door before Ethan could do it himself. Who lives here? Ethan asked as they approached the entrance. Someone who owes me a favor. The door opened before Damien could knock. A middle-aged beta in an expensive robe stood there, looking irritated until he saw who was on his doorstep. His expression immediately shifted to something between fear and respect. Damien. I wasn't expecting. I need a marriage license process tonight, Damien said simply. Backdated to 2 weeks ago. Full documentation. The beta's eyes widened. Tonight? That's highly irregular. The legal requirements alone can be expedited, but... Damien's tone didn't change, but something in it made the beta step back. You've done it before, Thomas. You'll do it now. Thomas looked at Ethan, then back at Damien, clearly calculating risks Ethan couldn't begin to understand. Finally, he nodded. Come in. This will take a few hours. Inside the townhouse, Ethan sat in a leather chair while Thomas, apparently a city clerk with questionable ethics and obvious fear of Damien, worked at a computer, creating paperwork that should have taken weeks. Damien stood by the window, watching the street below, his posture relaxed but his attention absolute. This is illegal, isn't it? Ethan said quietly. Technically, Damien admitted without looking at him. And you're fine with that? I've done worse things for worse reasons. Ethan should have been horrified. Should have walked out. But instead, he found himself asking, what happened to your mother? Damien went very still. For a long moment, Ethan thought he wouldn't answer. She needed help, he finally said, his voice soft and dangerous. She asked for it. Begged for it. And every person who could have saved her chose not to get involved. They had their reasons, good reasons, probably. Didn't want trouble. Didn't want complications. What happened to her? She died, Damien said simply. Alone. Afraid. Believing no one cared enough to risk anything for her. Ethan's throat tightened. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, Damien said, turning to face him. Be ready. Because tomorrow, you're going to walk into that courtroom with me, and you're going to convince a judge that you're stable, secure, and worthy of keeping your son. Can you do that? Ethan thought about everything he'd been through, the abuse, the running, the sleeping in cars and skipping meals so his son could eat, the shame of being judged by people who'd never had to choose between pride and survival. Yes, he said firmly. Good. Damien's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then we'll make sure you win. Thomas looked up from his computer. It's done. You're legally married as of 2 weeks ago. Congratulations. Ethan stared at the printed documents. Official seals. Signatures. A marriage certificate that proclaimed him Ethan Voss Blackwood. He'd just married an alpha whose last name he could barely pronounce, a man who scared city officials, a man who'd admitted to doing illegal things. And somehow, for the first time in months, Ethan felt like he might actually survive tomorrow. The rain had finally stopped by the time they left Thomas's townhouse, but the city streets were still slick and dark, reflecting the orange glow of streetlights like fractured mirrors. Ethan clutched the manila envelope containing his new identity, marriage certificate, proof of address, documentation that declared him a stable married Omega with a permanent home. None of it felt real. We need to pick up your son, Damien said as he navigated the Mercedes through the empty streets. Where is he? Ethan's heart clenched. My neighbor's watching him. Mrs. Deborah. She lives in the apartment building where I used to live before, he trailed off, not wanting to finish that sentence. Before you couldn't afford rent anymore, Damien finished for him, his tone neutral, without judgment. Yes. Address. Ethan gave it to him, watching the neighborhoods change as they drove from expensive to moderate to the kind of area where people didn't ask too many questions and landlords accepted cash. His old building looked sadder in the pre-dawn darkness, paint peeling, one security light flickering like it was gasping for air. Stay in the car, Damien said. He's my son. I'm coming. Damien looked at him, really looked at him, and Ethan saw him reassessing. All right. But let me do the talking if anyone asks questions. They climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, the stairwell smelling of old cooking and mildew. Ethan knocked softly on Mrs. Deborah's door, aware that it was nearly 2 in the morning, hoping the elderly beta woman wouldn't be too angry. The door opened a crack, chain still attached. Mrs. Deborah's weathered face peered through, then softened when she saw Ethan. Oh, honey, I was so worried. Is everything? She stopped when she noticed Damien behind Ethan, her eyes widening at the sight of the tall alpha in the expensive suit with tattoos climbing his neck. Mrs. Deborah, Ethan said quickly, this is my husband, Damien. We're here to pick up Jamie. Mrs. Deborah's eyes darted between them, confusion evident. Ethan had never mentioned a husband. Had barely mentioned anything about his personal life except that he was running from something dangerous. Your husband, she repeated slowly. It's complicated, Ethan said quietly, but I promise I'll explain everything later. Is Jamie asleep? Mrs. Deborah studied Damien for a long moment, the kind of assessment only a beta who'd lived through hardship could make. Whatever she saw must have satisfied some internal criteria, because she nodded slowly and opened the door. He's in the guest room. Fell asleep around 9. Sweet boy, didn't cry once. Ethan's eyes stung with gratitude. Thank you for everything. He moved past Mrs. Deborah into the small apartment, navigating by memory to the guest room. His son Jamie lay curled under a faded quilt, his dark curly hair spread across the pillow, his stuffed rabbit clutched against his chest. He looked so small, so innocent, so unaware that his entire world had nearly collapsed tonight. Ethan knelt beside the bed, gently brushing his son's hair back. Jamie, sweetheart. Time to wake up. Jamie's eyes fluttered open, confused and drowsy. Then he saw his father, and his face broke into a sleepy smile. Daddy. Hey, baby. We're going to our new house tonight. Can you wake up for me? Jamie rubbed his eyes and sat up, still clutching his rabbit. Then he noticed Damien standing in the doorway, tall, imposing, dressed in black. His smile faltered, his small body pressing closer to Ethan. Damien seemed to sense the child's fear. He crouched down slowly, making himself less intimidating, and spoke in a voice Ethan had never heard him use before, softer, gentler. Hello, Jamie. My name is Damien. I'm a friend of your dad's. We're going to go to a safe place where you can sleep in a real bed. Does that sound okay? Jamie looked at Ethan for confirmation. Ethan nodded, forcing a smile. It's okay, baby. He's helping us. Jamie studied Damien with the brutal honesty only children possess. You have drawings on your neck. I do, Damien said simply. Do you like to draw? Jamie nodded. I draw dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are impressive. Maybe you can show me your drawings sometime. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ease the fear in Jamie's eyes. Ethan helped him into his jacket and shoes, gathering the few belongings they'd brought, a backpack of clothes, the stuffed rabbit, a picture book with torn pages. Everything they owned fit in one backpack. Mrs. Deborah pressed a paper bag into Ethan's hands at the door. Snacks for the little one. You take care, honey. Then she looked at Damien. And you better be what he needs, or you'll answer to me. Damien's expression didn't change, but Ethan caught the faintest hint of respect in his eyes. Yes, ma'am. The drive to Damien's estate took 20 minutes, leading them away from the city into an area where properties were measured in acres rather than square feet. Jamie fell asleep again in the back seat, his head resting against Ethan's shoulder. Ethan watched the neighborhoods change through the window, from urban to suburban to something else entirely. When they turned through iron gates that opened automatically, Ethan's breath caught. The house, no, the estate, rose from perfectly manicured grounds like something from a magazine he'd never be able to afford. 3 stories of elegant architecture, stone and glass and deliberate design. Security cameras visible but discreet. Landscape lighting illuminating paths and gardens. Everything screamed money, power, and permanence. This was where he was supposed to convince a judge he lived. This is your house. Ethan whispered as Damien parked in a circular driveway. Yes. It's too much. No judge will believe I live here. They'll think you married well, Damien interrupted calmly. Which, according to our paperwork, you did. 2 weeks ago. Before Ethan could respond, the front door opened. A beta in his 50s emerged, fit, alert, wearing a simple black suit. His eyes swept the car with professional assessment before settling on Damien with clear respect. Sir. We weren't expecting you tonight. Circumstances changed, Bernard, Damien said, getting out of the car. Mr. Voss Blackwood and his son will be staying in the East Wing. Make sure the rooms are prepared. They'll need breakfast at 8, something child-friendly. Mr. Voss Blackwood. The name hit Ethan like a physical thing. Bernard's surprise lasted only a fraction of a second before his professional mask returned. "Of course, sir. I'll inform the staff." Damien opened Ethan's door and carefully lifted Jamie from the back seat. The boy didn't wake, simply curled against Damien's chest with the trust only sleeping children possess. The contrast was startling, this dangerous alpha holding his son like he was made of glass. "Come," Damien said quietly. "Let's get him to bed." Ethan followed him into the house, his wet shoes squeaking on marble floors. The interior was exactly what he'd expected, elegant, expensive, intimidating. High ceilings, original art, furniture that probably cost more than he'd made in his entire life. But it was also quiet, peaceful, safe. Damien led him up a curved staircase to the second floor, down a hallway lined with closed doors, finally stopping at a suite of rooms that looked like they belonged in a luxury hotel. A bedroom with a massive bed, an attached bathroom with marble fixtures, and a connecting smaller bedroom clearly meant for a child. He laid Jamie gently on the child-sized bed, stepping back to let Ethan tuck him in. "Everything you need should be here," Damien said quietly. "If it's not, there's an intercom panel by the door. Press the button, and someone will assist." Ethan stared at the room, at the safety it represented, and felt tears threatening again. "I don't understand any of this." "You don't need to understand it tonight," Damien said. "You need to sleep. Court is in 9 hours. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Ethan." "Yes?" "You're safe here. Both of you. Whatever happens tomorrow, you're safe." And then he was gone, leaving Ethan alone in a room that cost more than his entire life, with his son sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. He should have been terrified. Instead, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Ethan didn't sleep. He couldn't. He spent the remaining hours before dawn sitting in a chair by Jamie's bed, watching his son breathe in the safety of clean sheets and a room with no leaks, no cold drafts, no sounds of arguments bleeding through thin walls. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind raced through everything that could go wrong in court, every question the judge might ask, every crack in their story that could expose the truth. By the time pale morning light filtered through the curtains, Ethan felt hollowed out with exhaustion and fear. A soft knock at the door made him jump. A beta in his 40s entered, professional, kind-faced, wearing a simple gray suit. "Mr. Voss Blackwood?" "I'm Helen, the house manager. Mr. Blackwood asked me to help you prepare for court. I've brought clothing options, and breakfast will be ready downstairs in 20 minutes. Mr. Voss Blackwood." The name still felt like wearing someone else's skin. Helen laid out several outfits on the bed, conservative shirts, tailored jackets, everything in Ethan's size. How had they known? When had they had time to? "Mr. Blackwood is very thorough," Helen said gently, as if reading his thoughts. "He wants you to feel confident today." Confident? Ethan almost laughed. He was about to walk into court with an alpha he'd known for less than 6 hours and convince a judge they were a stable married couple. But he showered in the marble bathroom, dressed in a navy shirt that fit perfectly, and looked at himself in the mirror. The man staring back looked different, put together, respectable, like someone who had his life under control. He looked like a lie. Downstairs, the dining room was brighter than he'd expected, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens, a table that could seat 12 but was set for 3. Jamie was already there, sitting next to Damien, eating pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. The sight stopped Ethan in the doorway. Damien was still in his black suit, a different one, Ethan realized, freshly pressed, but he was leaning slightly toward Jamie, listening as his son explained something with animated hand gestures. The dangerous alpha from last night looked almost normal. "Daddy!" Jamie spotted him, and his face lit up. "Look!" They made T-Rex pancakes. And Mr. Damien says there's a library with books about real dinosaurs. That's wonderful, baby, Ethan said, moving to the table on shaking legs. Damien stood as he approached, a small gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that felt strangely intimate. Did you sleep? He asked quietly. No. Neither did I. He pulled out Ethan's chair. Eat. You'll need your strength. Ethan sat, accepting coffee from a staff member who appeared and disappeared like a ghost. He forced himself to eat toast he couldn't taste, drinking coffee that did nothing to settle his nerves. Court is at noon, Damien said, his voice low enough that Jamie wouldn't hear. My lawyers will meet us there at 11:30. They'll brief you on what to expect. Your lawyers? Ethan repeated. How many do you have? Enough. Before Ethan could press further, Bernard appeared in the doorway, his expression tight with concern. Sir. We have a situation. Damien's entire demeanor shifted, the casual breakfast companion disappearing, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. What kind of situation? Bernard glanced at Jamie, then at Ethan. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. No, Ethan said, surprising himself. If this affects Jamie, I need to know. Damien studied him for a moment, then nodded to Bernard. Report. There's been unusual activity this morning. 3 separate surveillance sweeps of the property perimeter. Different vehicles, but coordinated timing. And, Bernard hesitated. There's media presence at the courthouse. Significantly more than normal for a custody hearing. Ethan's blood ran cold. Media? How would they know about? Someone leaked it, Damien said, his voice dangerously calm. Someone wants this public. But why? Who would? Ethan stopped as realization hit. Derek. His ex-partner. The alpha he'd been running from. The corporate witness protected by the state, living in luxury while Ethan had been sleeping in his car. He's seen the paperwork, Ethan whispered. The marriage certificate. He knows I'm connected to you now. Damien's jaw tightened. What exactly does he have to gain from exposing this? Ethan's hands trembled around his coffee cup. Revenge. Control. He swore I'd never escape him. If he can't have me, he'll destroy any chance I have at stability. And if he's connected you to me, he looked up at Damien, fear coursing through him. He'll use you to prove I'm unfit. That I'm still involved with dangerous people. I am dangerous, Damien said simply. But not to you. Not to your son. The judge won't see it that way. If Derek's lawyers present evidence that he couldn't even say it. Couldn't voice what he suspected about Damien's real work. Bernard cleared his throat. There's more, sir. We've intercepted communications suggesting rival interests have taken notice of your change in status. Which interests? The Kovac family. The Eastern Syndicate. They're questioning why the Black Ledger suddenly has a husband and child. Some are seeing it as a vulnerability. Jamie continued eating his dinosaur pancakes, oblivious to the adult conversation happening above his head. But Ethan heard every word, felt every implication like a knife. I've made you a target, he whispered. No, Damien said firmly. You've given them something to miscalculate. There's a difference. How can you be so calm? They could use this against us in court. They could. They could try, Damien interrupted, his eyes meeting Ethan's with absolute certainty. Let them. Bernard shifted uncomfortably. Sir, perhaps we should postpone the hearing. Give ourselves time to control the narrative. No, Ethan said immediately. We can't postpone. If we don't show up today, I lose Jamie automatically. The judge ruled it has to be today. Then we go today, Damien said. Bernard, increase security. I want a full detail at the courthouse. Contact Mitchell, tell him to prepare for aggressive opposition. Sir, if the media connects you to organized, they won't prove anything they can't already prove, Damien said coldly. I've been careful. My legal exposure is minimal. What they'll find is a businessman who stepped away from questionable associations months ago. That's the story. That's what the records will show. Because you planned this, Ethan said slowly. You've been preparing to go legitimate. I've been preparing for a lot of things, Damien admitted. This just accelerated the timeline. A phone rang, Bernard's. He answered, listened, his face darkening. Understood. He ended the call and looked at Damien. Derek Mitchell just gave an interview to the morning news. He's claiming you're a known criminal and that Ethan married you to hide assets and maintain dangerous connections. Ethan felt the room spin. No. No, no, no. He's also requesting emergency custody, Bernard continued. His lawyers are arguing that the child is now in immediate danger due to exposure to criminal elements. Jamie looked up from his pancakes, sensing the tension. Daddy? Are you okay? Ethan forced a smile, his face feeling like plastic. I'm fine, baby. Finish your breakfast. But he wasn't fine. Everything was collapsing. Derek had found his weak point and was exploiting it perfectly. By connecting him to Damien, he'd turned his salvation into his damnation. Damien stood, his movements controlled but radiating barely contained fury. Bernard, get Mitchell on the phone. Now. Sir, your lawyers would advise against direct contact at this. Now. Within 2 minutes, Bernard handed Damien a phone. Ethan watched as Damien's expression went perfectly, terrifyingly blank. Mitchell. This is Damien Blackwood. A pause. Yes, that Blackwood. I'm calling about the interview you gave this morning. The one where you made claims about my husband. Ethan could hear raised voice on the other end, Derek's voice, aggressive and smug. Damien's response was ice. I'm going to say this once. Drop your custody claim. Drop your media campaign. Walk away. Because if you continue this path, I will dedicate considerable resources to ensuring every illegal thing you've ever done, every corner you've cut, every lie you've told your handlers becomes public record. Your protection only extends as far as your usefulness. Make yourself more trouble than you're worth, and they'll feed you to the wolves themselves. Silence on the other end. That's what I thought, Damien said quietly. See you in court. He ended the call and handed the phone back to Bernard. When he looked at Ethan, his eyes were still hard, but his voice softened slightly. This isn't over. But neither are we. Ethan wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that anything could overcome what was coming. But as he held Jamie close and watched Damien make calculated calls to lawyers and security teams, he couldn't shake the feeling that by accepting the Alpha's help, he'd stepped into a war he didn't understand. And wars always had casualties. The hours before court moved too fast and too slow simultaneously. Ethan found himself in Damien's private office, a room of dark wood and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, sitting across from 2 lawyers who looked like they billed by the minute. Mitchell Thorne, the lead attorney, was in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of face that had argued before Supreme Courts. His associate, a sharp-eyed beta named Rebecca Yates, took notes on a tablet while Mitchell walked them through what was coming. The opposition will attack from 3 angles, Mitchell said, his tone clinical. First, they'll question the legitimacy of your marriage, how quickly it happened, the convenience of timing. Second, they'll try to connect Mr. Blackwood to criminal activity. Third, and most damaging, they'll argue that Jamie is now in proximity to dangerous elements. Ethan felt sick. Can they win? They can try, Mitchell said. Our job is to ensure they fail. Which means you two need to be flawless. The judge will be watching every interaction, every response. You need to convince her that this marriage, while sudden, is genuine. How do we do that? Ethan asked. We've known each other less than 12 hours. Then you learn everything you need to know in the next 3, Rebecca said, not unkindly. We start now. For the next 2 hours, they rehearsed. Rebecca fired questions rapid fire while Mitchell observed, taking notes on body language, hesitations, anything that might raise suspicion. How did you meet? Ethan looked at Damien. They'd discussed this briefly in the car, but now, under scrutiny, it felt impossible, fragile. At the diner where I work, Ethan said. He came in regularly for coffee. We started talking. When was your first date? 3 weeks ago, Damien answered smoothly. I took him to Juliana's Italian restaurant on 5th Street. Ethan blinked. That was specific. Had he actually researched restaurants to make the story believable? What did he order? Rebecca pressed. Damien didn't hesitate. He said he wasn't hungry. Ordered soup. He was nervous. It was such a small detail, but it felt real, the kind of thing an alpha would remember about someone he cared for. Ethan realized Damien was building a story that fit his personality, his circumstances, an omega too anxious to eat on a first date with an alpha who clearly had money. Why did you marry so quickly? Mitchell asked. Because when you know, Damien said simply. And Ethan needed stability. I could provide it. Why wait? The judge will call that convenient, Rebecca warned. The judge can call it whatever she wants, Damien said. It's the truth. Except it wasn't. And they all knew it. Your turn, Ethan, Mitchell said. What's Damien's morning routine? Ethan's mind went blank. He'd spent one night in this alpha's house. He had no idea. Coffee, black, at 5:30, Damien said quietly, feeding him the answer. I read news on my tablet for 30 minutes. Exercise at 6. Shower at 7. I'm usually dressed by 7:30. Ethan repeated it, committing it to memory. But Rebecca shook her head. You're reciting. A husband would know this naturally. Add details. Personal observations. Ethan tried again. He wakes up early, before dawn. Drinks his coffee black while reading the news. He's disciplined about exercise, won't skip it even when he's busy. He paused, then added something he'd noticed that morning. He's quiet in the morning. Not unfriendly, just thoughtful. Like he's preparing for the day. Mitchell nodded approvingly. Better. That felt real. Because it was real. Ethan had observed those things, even if he was just learning them. They continued for another hour. Favorite foods. Sleep patterns. Small arguments they might have had. The prosecution would look for cracks, for moments where their stories didn't align or their knowledge of each other seemed shallow. But something strange was happening as they rehearsed, as Damien supplied details and Ethan absorbed them. The lies started feeling less like a lie. He was learning him, the way he thought, the precision of his mind, the unexpected gentleness beneath the controlled exterior. Break, Mitchell finally announced. 15 minutes. You're doing well. But we need to address the elephant in the room. He looked directly at Damien. They're going to bring up your past. Your associations. We need to know, how bad is it? Damien's expression didn't change. Nothing they can prove in court. I've been careful. My businesses are legitimate. My taxes are paid. Any connections to questionable activities are circumstantial at best. Circumstantial can still damage credibility, Rebecca said. Then we don't run from it, Damien said. We acknowledge it. I was involved in things I'm not proud of. I've since distanced myself. Reformed. That's a narrative judges appreciate, redemption. And if they have evidence? Mitchell pressed. They don't. The certainty in Damien's voice was absolute. Mitchell studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. We'll use it. Paint you as a man who walked away from a dark past to build something legitimate. That plays well. Especially when combined with the protective husband narrative. After the lawyers left to finalize courtroom strategy, Ethan and Damien were alone in the office. The silence felt heavy. You're good at this, Ethan said quietly. The lying. The details. It comes naturally to you. It's survival, Damien said. When you grow up the way I did, you learn to build stories people want to believe. What way did you grow up? Damien was silent for a long moment. Then, poor. Violent. My mother worked 3 jobs, and it still wasn't enough. My father was absent, and when he wasn't absent, he was worse than absent. Ethan heard the weight behind those carefully chosen words. That's why you helped me. Because of your mother. Yes. What would she think of this? Of you? Damien's jaw tightened. She'd probably tell me I was being reckless. That I was risking everything I built for someone I don't know. And what would you tell her? Damien finally looked at him, really looked at him, and something in his eyes shifted. I'd tell her that some risks are worth taking. That not every calculation is about profit and loss. That sometimes. He trailed off, seeming to catch himself. Sometimes what? Ethan pressed. Sometimes protecting someone matters more than protecting yourself. The words hung between them, intimate and dangerous. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, not attraction exactly, but recognition. This alpha understood what it meant to fight for survival. Understood the cost of choosing vulnerability. A knock at the door broke the moment. Helen appeared. Mr. Blackwood, the cars are ready. And Jamie is asking for his father. Ethan stood, smoothing his shirt. How do I look? Like someone who belongs here, Damien said, rising as well, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced ease. You look like someone who's survived things that would break most people. The judge will see that. So will everyone else. Is that good or bad? It's honest, Damien said. And right now, that's all we have. They found Jamie in the foyer with Bernard, holding his stuffed rabbit and looking small in his nice clothes, khakis and a button-down shirt that Helen must have procured. He brightened when he saw Ethan. Are we going to see the judge now? He asked. Yes, baby. Remember what we talked about? You're going to be very brave and answer their questions truthfully. Will you be there? The whole time, Ethan promised, kneeling to hug him. I'm not going anywhere. Jamie looked at Damien over Ethan's shoulder. Will you be there too? Damien crouched down, meeting Jamie at eye level. Yes. I'll be right next to your dad. And I promise, no matter what happens in that room, you're safe. Understand? Jamie nodded solemnly. Then, with the unself-conscious trust only children possess, he reached out and took Damien's hand. The gesture seemed to surprise Damien. For just a moment, his controlled mask slipped, and Ethan saw something raw in his expression. vulnerability. Maybe even fear. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar calm certainty. "Let's go," Damien said, standing. "Time to win." They walked out together, a manufactured family built on lies and desperation, walking into a courtroom that would decide if those lies were strong enough to become truth. And as they climbed into the Mercedes, surrounded by security and lawyers and the weight of impossible stakes, Ethan realized something terrifying. He was starting to believe the lie himself. Starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be real. The courthouse steps were swarming with media. Ethan saw them through the tinted windows of the Mercedes, cameras, microphones, reporters jostling for position like predators sensing blood. His stomach dropped. "I can't do this," he whispered. "I can't walk through that." Damien's hand found his, firm and steady. "Yes, you can. Keep your head up. Say nothing. Let them see you're not afraid." "But I am afraid." "Then fake it," Damien said, his voice low and certain. "I'll be right beside you. They can take pictures, but they can't touch you." The car stopped. Bernard opened the door, and suddenly the roar of questions hit like a physical wave. "Mr. Voss Blackwood, is it true you married a known criminal?" "Ethan, how do you respond to allegations of endangering your child?" "Mr. Blackwood, are you using this Omega as a cover for?" Damien stepped out first, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was a wall of controlled menace in his black suit, his tattooed hand visible as he reached back to help Ethan out. The cameras exploded with flashes. Ethan took his hand and emerged, keeping his chin up like he'd been instructed. Jamie pressed against his other side. He felt exposed, violated, every lens trained on him like weapons. But Damien's hand never left his as they walked through the gauntlet, security forming a corridor through the chaos. The questions kept coming, accusations dressed as inquiries, but Damien moved through them like they didn't exist. His face was perfectly blank, his stride unhurried. To anyone watching, he looked like an alpha with nothing to hide. Inside the courthouse, the noise finally cut off as heavy doors closed behind them. Ethan's legs were shaking. Jamie buried his face against his stomach, overwhelmed. "You did well," Damien said quietly. "Both of you." Mitchell and Rebecca were waiting by the courtroom entrance, both looking grim. "They're playing for blood," Mitchell said without preamble. "Derek's legal team just filed an emergency motion to have Jamie removed from your custody immediately, before the hearing even begins. They're arguing imminent danger." "On what grounds?" Damien demanded. "Your presence," Rebecca said. "They've compiled a dossier, associates you've had, businesses you've been connected to, surveillance photos. Nothing that directly proves criminal activity, but enough to paint a disturbing picture." Ethan felt his world tilting. "Can they do that? Just take him before we even get a chance to." "The judge will hear arguments first," Mitchell interrupted. "But I won't lie to you. This just got significantly harder." They entered the courtroom. It was smaller than Ethan expected, more intimate, which somehow made it worse. Every eye would be on them, every reaction scrutinized. Derek was already there, sitting with his lawyers at the opposing table. He looked good, healthy, well-dressed, the picture of stability. When he saw Ethan, his smile was cold and triumphant. This was what he'd wanted all along. Not Jamie, not family. Just the satisfaction of destroying him. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. Damien noticed, leaning close to whisper, "Don't give him the reaction he wants. Stay calm." They took their seats. Jamie sat between them, clutching his rabbit. A social worker appeared, Miss Hartley, the same cold voice from the phone, and took Jamie to a separate waiting area where he'd stay during the proceedings. "Daddy?" Jamie's voice was small, frightened. "I'll come get you soon, baby. I promise." The door closed behind him, and Ethan felt like his heart was being torn from his chest. Damien's hand found his again under the table, hidden from view. The gesture was small but anchoring. "All rise." Judge Morrison entering. Judge Morrison was a beta in her 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She surveyed the courtroom with the expression of someone who'd seen every manipulation, every lie, every desperate gambit. "Be seated." Her voice was firm, brooking no nonsense. "Let's be clear about what we're doing here. This is an emergency custody hearing regarding the minor child, James Voss. I've reviewed the initial filings, and I'm disturbed by several aspects of this case." Ethan's heart hammered. Already it was going badly. Judge Morrison continued. "Mr. Voss, or should I say Mr. Voss Blackwood, you presented yourself yesterday as a single Omega with unstable housing. Today you appear with a husband, a marriage certificate dated 2 weeks ago, and residence at one of the most expensive estates in the county. The timing is, to put it mildly, suspicious." Mitchell stood. "Your Honor, if I may." "You may not." "Sit down, counsel. I'm not finished." The judge's eyes fixed on Damien. "Mr. Blackwood, your reputation precedes you. While I cannot speak to allegations that have never resulted in charges, I can say that your sudden involvement in this case raises serious questions about the environment this child would be entering." Derek's lawyer, a shark in an expensive suit named Harrison Webb, stood smoothly. "Your Honor, if I may present our evidence regarding Mr. Blackwood's associations." "You may," Judge Morrison said. What followed was a systematic assassination. Webb presented surveillance photos of Damien meeting with known figures from organized crime families. Financial records showing money moving through complex corporate structures. Testimony from law enforcement officials describing Damien as a person of interest in multiple ongoing investigations. None of it was proof, but all of it was damning. Ethan watched Damien's face remain perfectly controlled, but he could feel the tension in the alpha's hand. This was worse than they'd expected. Webb was building a narrative that painted Damien as exactly what he'd spent years becoming, a criminal power broker who operated in shadows. "Your Honor," Webb concluded, "we're not asking this court to prove Mr. Blackwood guilty of any crime. We're simply asking, is this the environment for a 6-year-old child? A home surrounded by armed security, surveillance, and an alpha whose associations are at best questionable?" He turned to Ethan, and his expression shifted to something almost pitying. "Mr. Voss Blackwood, we understand you were desperate. But desperation led you to make a dangerous choice. Our client, Mr. Mitchell, has a stable home, legal employment, and most importantly, no connection to criminal elements. He can provide what this child needs, safety." "Your client is an abuser," Ethan said, the words bursting out before he could stop them. "He put me in the hospital twice. He—" "Mr. Voss Blackwood," Judge Morrison's voice cut through, "you'll have your chance to testify. But these allegations against Mr. Mitchell were investigated and deemed unsubstantiated. Because he threatened me into silence." Ethan's voice broke. "Because the system protected him instead of Mr. Voss Blackwood." Mitchell stood, his voice firm but not unkind. "Let me handle this." But the damage was done. Ethan saw it in the judge's face, the flicker of doubt, the assessment of an Omega who appeared unstable, emotional, willing to make desperate accusations. Webb pressed his advantage. "Your Honor, this outburst demonstrates exactly what we're concerned about. Mr. Voss Blackwood's judgment is compromised. He's aligned himself with a dangerous alpha. He's making wild accusations. And he's clearly not in a mental state to." "Enough." Damien's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. He stood slowly, and every eye turned to him. Judge Morrison's expression sharpened with warning. "Mr. Blackwood, you are not a lawyer. Sit down." "No." The single word hung in the air like a detonation. Mitchell looked panicked. Rebecca half rose from her seat. But Damien's attention was fixed entirely on the judge. "Your Honor, with respect, you're about to make a decision based on incomplete information. You're being presented with a narrative designed to make me look dangerous and Mr. Voss Blackwood look desperate. And while both of those things may contain elements of truth, they're not the whole truth. Mr. Blackwood. I'm not finished." Damien's tone was respectful but unyielding. "You want to know who I am? What I've done? I'll tell you. But I'll do it under oath, subject to cross-examination. Because unlike the prosecution, I'm not interested in implications and associations. I'm interested in facts." Judge Morrison studied him for a long, tense moment. "You understand that anything you say can be used in future proceedings against you?" "I understand." "And your lawyers are advising against this?" "They are," Damien said. "I'm doing it anyway." Mitchell looked like he might have a heart attack. But Rebecca was watching Damien with something like awe, recognition of a calculated risk that just might work. Judge Morrison leaned back in her chair. "Very well, Mr. Blackwood. Bailiff, swear him in." Damien moved to the witness stand with that same controlled grace, his hand resting on the Bible. Ethan realized what he was doing, gambling everything, his freedom, his empire, his carefully constructed walls on the truth. For him. For Jamie. For a family that existed only on paper. The bailiff's voice echoed in the silent courtroom. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Damien's eyes found Ethan's across the room. "I do," he said. And the trap he'd been building for himself finally snapped shut. Webb approached the witness stand like a predator circling wounded prey, his smile calculated, confident. He had Damien exactly where he wanted him, under oath, on record, vulnerable. "Mr. Blackwood, let's start simply. What do you do for a living?" "I own several businesses," Damien said calmly. "Import-export, real estate holdings, investment portfolios." "How profitable are these businesses?" "Very. Enough to maintain an estate worth $12 million. "Yes." Webb's smile widened. "In these businesses, they've always been legitimate." The courtroom went silent. Mitchell looked like he might vomit. Ethan's hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles went white. Damien didn't hesitate. "No." A ripple of reaction moved through the room. Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly. "Could you elaborate?" Webb asked, barely containing his triumph. "Until approximately 8 months ago, I was involved in activities that existed in legal gray areas. I facilitated transactions between parties who didn't trust traditional banking systems. I mediated disputes that couldn't be resolved through legal channels. I provided services that skirted the edges of the law." "You're describing organized crime," Webb said. "I'm describing survival in communities where the legal system has failed," Damien corrected. "But yes. If you want to call it organized crime, I won't argue semantics." Ethan felt his world collapsing. He was confessing, giving them everything they needed to destroy both of them. "And you expect this court to believe you simply walked away from this life?" Webb asked mockingly. "I don't expect anything," Damien said. "But I can prove it." He reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a folder. Mitchell looked stunned. This wasn't part of their strategy. "Your Honor," Damien said, "may I present evidence?" Judge Morrison's expression was unreadable. "Approach." Damien handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. She opened it, her eyes scanning the documents. Her expression shifted, surprise, then calculation, then something Ethan couldn't quite read. "These are cooperation agreements," Judge Morrison said slowly, "with federal prosecutors. Dated 7 months ago." "Yes, Your Honor. I've been working with law enforcement to dismantle the same networks I once facilitated. I've provided evidence that's led to 14 arrests and the seizure of over $60 million in illegal assets. I've testified in 3 federal cases. I'm currently under witness protection protocols." The courtroom erupted. Webb looked blindsided. Derek's face went pale. Even Mitchell seemed shocked. "Why wasn't this disclosed earlier?" Judge Morrison demanded. "Because the investigations are ongoing," Damien said. "And because my cooperation is predicated on confidentiality. But when the choice is between protecting operational security and protecting a child, the choice is obvious." Webb scrambled to recover. "This could be fabricated. How do we know?" "Call the U.S. Attorney's Office," Damien said flatly. "Ask for Assistant Director Catherine Brennan. She'll confirm everything, though she'll be extremely unhappy that I've revealed this in open court." Judge Morrison was already reaching for her phone. She stepped into her chambers. The wait felt eternal. When she returned, her entire demeanor had changed. "Mr. Webb, your theatrics regarding Mr. Blackwood's character are noted but rendered largely irrelevant. According to federal authorities, Mr. Blackwood has indeed been cooperating extensively. His current status is that of a protected witness who has demonstrated significant efforts toward reformation." Webb looked like he'd been punched. "Your Honor, regardless of his cooperation with authorities, the fact remains that Mr. Voss Blackwood married him under suspicious circumstances." "Let me address that," Damien interrupted. He turned his attention fully to Judge Morrison. "Your Honor, you asked if I expect this court to believe I simply walked away from my former life. The truth is more complicated. I walked away because I was tired. Tired of violence, tired of watching people destroy themselves and each other, tired of being the alpha everyone feared but no one trusted." His voice softened slightly. "And then I met Ethan. Not 3 weeks ago. That marriage certificate is backdated because we needed it to be. But the truth is, I met him 6 hours before we walked into that clerk's office. I overheard him crying in a diner, desperate to save his son. And I made a choice. Not because I knew him. Not because I owed him anything. But because 23 years ago, my mother sat in a similar situation, and every person who could have helped her chose not to get involved." The courtroom was absolutely silent. "My mother died believing no one cared enough to risk anything for her. So when I heard Ethan's plea, I decided that this time, someone would care. This time, someone would risk something, even if it was inconvenient, even if it was complicated, even if it exposed me in ways I'd spent years avoiding." He looked at Ethan, his expression unguarded for the first time since they'd met. "I don't love him. I barely know him. But I believe he deserves the chance to be the father his son needs. And I believe that child deserves better than what the system has offered him. So yes, Your Honor, this marriage is unconventional. It's recent. It's built on desperation and timing. But it's also the most honest thing I've done in years. Because it's not about what I gain. It's about what they don't lose." Judge Morrison sat motionless, her hands folded on the bench, her eyes moving between Damien, Ethan, and Derek. The silence stretched until Ethan thought he might scream from the tension. "Mr. Webb," the judge finally said, "do you have any actual evidence of abuse or neglect by Mr. Voss Blackwood toward his son?" Webb shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, while we don't have direct evidence of abuse, the environment he's created by associating with. That's not what I asked. evidence of abuse or neglect? Yes or no? No, Your Honor. But... And Mr. Mitchell's allegations of domestic violence against Mr. Voss Blackwood, those were investigated by authorities and substantiated? The investigations were inconclusive due to Mr. Voss Blackwood's refusal to cooperate. Because he was terrified, Ethan said, his voice breaking. He stood, unable to contain it anymore. Your Honor, he broke my ribs. He choked me until I passed out. He told me if I ever reported him, he'd make sure I never saw Jamie again. And he almost succeeded. Judge Morrison's expression softened fractionally. Mr. Voss Blackwood, I've read the medical reports. I've seen the restraining order you attempted to file before withdrawing it. I understand fear. What I need to understand is whether you're capable of making sound decisions for your child's welfare now. I am, Ethan said firmly. Marrying Damien might look desperate to you, but it was the sanest decision I've made in years. Because for the first time, someone stood between me and the people trying to destroy me. Someone said no, this stops here. That's not instability, Your Honor. That's strength. Derek's lawyer tried again. Your Honor, even if we accept Mr. Blackwood's reformation, the marriage is clearly a legal maneuver. Of course it is, Judge Morrison said dryly. So is Mr. Mitchell's sudden interest in custody after years of absence. Let's not pretend this courtroom is filled with pure motives. She looked at Derek directly. Mr. Mitchell, when was the last time you saw your son before this custody filing? Derek's jaw tightened. I was in protective custody. I couldn't. That's not what I asked. 18 months, Your Honor. 18 months. And in that time, how many letters did you send him? Phone calls? Video chats? Silence. None, Derek finally admitted. But I was protecting him by staying away from. From what? His father, who was raising him alone while you enjoyed federal protection and a comfortable living situation. Judge Morrison's voice had an edge now. Mr. Mitchell, I don't doubt you've contributed valuable testimony in your cases. But let's be honest about what this custody claim represents. This isn't about your son's welfare. This is about control over Mr. Voss Blackwood. Your Honor, I object to this characterization. Objection noted and overruled. I've been a family court judge for 19 years, Mr. Webb. I know vindictive custody battles when I see them. She turned back to Ethan and Damien. That said, Mr. Voss Blackwood, your situation is highly irregular. This marriage is days old. Your husband, regardless of his cooperation with authorities, comes from a world most people can't comprehend. Can you honestly tell me you understand what you've gotten yourself and your son into? Ethan looked at Damien. The alpha met his eyes, and Ethan saw everything he'd risked laid bare, his secrets, his past, his carefully constructed life, all of it exposed in this courtroom because he'd chosen to stand beside him. No, Your Honor, Ethan said honestly. I don't fully understand his world. I probably never will. But I understand that he kept his promises. He said he'd give me a house, he did. He said he'd stand beside me in court, he's here. He said Jamie would be safe, and for the first time in months, my son slept through the night without nightmares. I can't predict the future. But I can tell you that right now, this moment, I trust him more than I trust the system that almost separated me from my child. Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up her gavel. I'm going to make a ruling that will likely be appealed. But based on the evidence before me, and more importantly, based on 19 years of watching parents fight over children like property, here's what I see. I see an Omega who has survived domestic violence and poverty while keeping his child safe. I see an Alpha with a complicated past who has taken concrete steps toward reformation. And I see a vindictive ex-partner using the legal system as a weapon. She looked directly at Ethan. Mr. Voss Blackwood, custody remains with you. Full legal custody. Mr. Mitchell, you'll have supervised visitation rights pending completion of a family counseling assessment. This court recognizes your marriage to Mr. Blackwood as legal and binding. Ethan couldn't breathe. Couldn't process. However, Judge Morrison continued, I'm ordering a 6-month review. Social services will conduct regular home visits. If at any point I believe Jamie is in danger, I will not hesitate to revisit this decision. Mr. Blackwood, your cooperation with authorities works in your favor today. Don't make me regret giving you this chance. You won't, Your Honor, Damien said quietly. The gavel came down. This hearing is adjourned. The courtroom cleared slowly, but Ethan couldn't move. He sat frozen in his chair, staring at his hands, trying to process what had just happened. They'd won. Jamie was his. The nightmare was over. Except it wasn't over. Not really. Damien stood beside him, silent and watchful, as reporters shouted questions from the hallway, as Derek stormed out with his lawyers, as Mitchell and Rebecca packed their briefcases with barely concealed relief. Ethan, Damien said quietly. We need to get Jamie. Right. Jamie. His son was waiting in a room down the hall, probably terrified, probably convinced he was about to be taken away. Ethan stood on shaking legs and followed Damien through a side door that bypassed the media circus. The moment Jamie saw him, he ran. Ethan dropped to his knees and caught him, holding him so tight he thought his chest might crack open. The boy was crying, his small body trembling, and Ethan realized he was crying too. It's okay, baby. You're staying with me. We're going home. Forever? Jamie's voice was muffled against his shoulder. Forever, Ethan promised. He felt Damien's presence behind them, steady, protective, but keeping his distance, giving them this moment. When he finally looked up, he saw something in the alpha's face he hadn't seen before. Not quite vulnerability, but something close. Like watching them had reminded him of something he'd lost, or never had. The drive back to the estate was quiet. Jamie fell asleep in the back seat almost immediately, exhausted from stress. Ethan watched the city pass by, feeling untethered. Everything had changed in less than 24 hours, and he didn't know how to exist in this new reality. You didn't have to do that, he said finally. Expose yourself like that. Risk everything. Yes, I did, Damien said simply. Why? He was quiet for a long time. Because some things matter more than protection. More than secrets. He paused, then continued, his voice low. You asked me in the diner why I was doing this, and I told you about my mother. But that's not the whole truth. The truth is, I've spent 15 years building walls, becoming untouchable, making sure I never needed anyone and no one could hurt me. And somewhere in all that protection, I forgot what it felt like to actually stand for something, to risk something for a reason that wasn't calculated or strategic. He glanced at Ethan briefly before returning his eyes to the road. You reminded me. Not because you asked for it, but because you were drowning and still fighting. Still choosing your son over safety, over comfort, over everything. That kind of courage deserves to be answered. Ethan's throat tightened. I'm not courageous. I was terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Damien said. It's doing what's necessary despite it. Back at the estate, Helen had prepared lunch, but none of them were hungry. Jamie wanted to see the library Damien had mentioned, so they walked through the house together, this strange, manufactured family trying to figure out what they were to each other. Damien showed Jamie the shelves of books, pulling down volumes about dinosaurs and prehistoric life. He spoke to the child with unexpected patience, answering questions, never talking down to him. And Jamie, who'd been so afraid of strangers, so traumatized by instability, slowly began to relax. Ethan watched from the doorway, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was supposed to be transactional, temporary, a legal arrangement that would end when the dust settled. But watching Damien explain the difference between Cretaceous and Jurassic periods to his 6-year-old son, Ethan realized something terrifying: he didn't want it to end. That evening, after Jamie was asleep in his room, not a car, not a motel, his actual room, Ethan found Damien on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The rain had finally stopped, leaving everything clean and sharp in the fading light. "I need to know what happens now," Ethan said, joining him at the railing. "What do you want to happen?" Damien asked. "That's not fair. You made the offer. You set the terms. I leave when this is over, remember?" "I remember." "So when is it over? When does the arrangement end?" Damien turned to face him fully. In the fading light, his features were softer, less guarded. "It ends when you want it to. Not a day before. Not a day after." Ethan's breath caught. "That's not what we agreed." "We agreed you could leave whenever you wanted," Damien corrected. "We never said you had to." The implication hung between them, heavy, dangerous, full of possibilities neither of them had planned for. "I don't know how to do this," Ethan whispered. "I don't know how to be married to someone I barely know. Someone whose world terrifies me. Someone who what? Someone who makes me feel safer than I've ever felt in my life. And I don't understand why." Damien's expression shifted, something vulnerable breaking through his carefully controlled exterior. "I don't have easy answers, Ethan. I can't promise you normal. I can't promise you simple. But I can promise you this: you and Jamie are under my protection. Not as property, not as obligation, as choice. My choice. And that means something in my world. It means no one touches you. No one threatens you. No one makes you afraid again. And if I choose to stay?" Ethan asked, his voice barely audible. "What then?" Damien reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from his face. The gesture was gentle, almost reverent. "Then we figure it out," he said quietly. "Together. One day at a time. No scripts, no calculations. Just possibility." Ethan looked back toward the house, where his son slept peacefully for the first time in months. Then he looked at the alpha beside him, dangerous, complicated, broken in ways that somehow fit with his own fractures. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's try." And in that moment, standing on a terrace under clearing skies, something impossible became real. A family built not on love, but on choice. Not on romance, but on respect. Not on fairy tales, but on two people who'd survived enough darkness to recognize light when it appeared. Sometimes miracles don't look like heaven. Sometimes they look like an alpha in a black suit who decides not to walk away. The end.